Very quickly to run us through the agenda today. Maybe at the start of it all, I should have introduced myself, but my name is Josh Ogada. I'm with South North, which is part of the Voices for Just Climate Action Alliance, and I serve as knowledge management and communications specialist. To go very quickly through our agenda today, we have done the instructions. We will very quickly go into setting the scene and talk a little bit about inclusive decision-making. We've got a wonderful array of speakers with us today who we will ask to reflect on a set of different questions around inclusive decision-making. In between, because we want this session to be as interactive as possible, we have a couple of Mentimeter questions that we will ask you to access. The link to that will be shared in the chat, and we will ask you to give some responses to a couple of statements. And in between the different statements, we will have a bit of a panel discussion with our speakers. And at that point, of course, we will also be inviting US participants to be part of that. So after the two panel discussions, then hopefully we'll be at the moment where we can have closure and maybe talk about next steps if there are any, but also hear feedback from you about the session. So a very warm welcome to all of you once again, and looking forward to a really good session. It would be remiss of me to point out that for us in this alliance especially, language justice is a very, very important thing. We're talking about justice, and language justice is part of that. We are privileged to have with us today speakers of Brazilian Portuguese, and this is why we have Portuguese interpretation available. I would ask that all of the speakers, and I include myself in this, so myself and the panelists, to kindly speak as clearly and as concisely as possible at a fair pace, so that we can make sure that the interpretation is clear and on pace for those who do not speak the language that you're communicating in. So if there is any need to give a reminder on that, I will do that as we go along. So very quickly moving along now to set the scene. Next slide, please. Before I do that, I'm going to just do a quick introduction of our speakers. We have today with us, and I do apologize in advance if I do not pronounce your name correctly, but I will do my best. Dewi Candraningrum, who's a lecturer, women activist, and founder of Jejer Wadon Art Space in Indonesia. We also have with us Lily Singelengele, who's the executive director of the Green Agricultural Youth Organization. We also have with us Melanie Chirwa from the Slum Dwellers International affiliate in Zambia. Brenda Tembo as well from Slum Dwellers International, Zambia. And we have Samela Sateré Mawé, a representative of the National Articulation of Indigenous Women Warriors of Ancestrality, which is a partner in the VCA Alliance. A warm welcome again to you as our panelists, and looking forward to hear your contributions. Just to set the scene a little bit, obviously the title of this session is Breaking Boundaries, Unraveling Injustices in Climate Decision-Making, and this is we are grounding this discussion on the principles of locally led adaptation, specifically the first one that talks specifically about devolving decision-making to the lowest appropriate level, which implies giving local institutions and communities more direct access to finance, but more importantly, decision-making power over how adaptation actions are defined, prioritized, designed, implemented, monitored, and how the eventual success of these is going to be evaluated. So as we talk about this, we are cognizant of the unequal impacts of climate change. We understand quite clearly that certain vulnerable groups and disadvantaged groups, as well as marginalized groups, suffer inordinately from the brunt of climate change. However, there are structural inequalities that mean that those groups that are most affected also do not have a place at the decision-making table. And this is very, very important, because if there are problems that face these groups, the solutions are being designed without any input from these groups. That clearly is a problem that at a structural level does need to be covered. So in this session, we want to talk a little bit about how we expose what exactly is the nature of this injustice. We need to expose it, but we also need to explore it, how it manifests itself, and how we can work towards opening a space for the marginalized groups to share their experiences, share their view, and share the solutions that they have, but also be part of a decision-making process that ultimately will benefit them as those who are most impacted. This is also a space where we hope that we as individuals, as members of different organizations, can also engage in a process of introspection, look inside and find out what it is that we do as individuals and what it is that we do as organizations that perpetuates these injustices. How can it change? And how can we move forward to a space where the injustices in climate decision-making are finally a thing of the past? So looking forward to that discussion. So at this point, I think I am ready to welcome our first speaker, Dewi, to give us a couple of reflections on this and to look at a couple of questions, which I'm going to ask all of you as the speakers to reflect a little bit on. So we would like you as the speakers, and you going first, Dewi, to talk a little bit about what your experiences has been with non-inclusive decision-making in your space. What has the injustice or exclusion of groups, what have you seen? And in your view, what are the underlying structures and beliefs that undergird this injustice around the injustice and non-inclusion in decision-making spaces? And also just to focus a little bit on your own role, what is it that you can do differently or that you're already doing differently in your work to allow for more meaningful participation and representation of marginalized groups? So I'm going to hand over to you, Dewi. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Shall I answer all the questions, the three questions all at once, or the first question first? What do you think?
I think it's entirely up to you. Look, there will be lots of space within in the panel discussions to delve a little deeper. So either just at a very preliminary level, all three, or if there's one that you'd like to focus on particularly, that's fine as well.
Yeah, thank you. I think how we could end. What is my experience in the non-inclusive decision making, and how, from my perspective, participation of specific group could be enhanced. I think if we could measure, manage, and improve who is involved and how decisions are made across climate adaptation, so that we can improve climate resilience. I think inclusive decision making activates diversity to improve innovation, diversity to improve engagement, and diversity result across the enterprises. In Indonesia right now, from 2016 till 2020, we are grateful that one of the priority of the national finance is on climate change. But the climate finance mechanism in Indonesia has hindered women and the poor from adapting to and mitigating climate change. So this climate finance mechanism in Indonesia is basically attentive to poverty affiliation, but gender equality has not received commensurate attention. So we ask for like system for monitoring, evaluating, learning from gender and poverty outcomes are weak and non-existent. And Indonesian national level policies support gender equality, but people who are implementing them in the climate finance mechanism do not have a common understanding of what it is and why it matters. For example, during the natural disaster in across Indonesia, the victims are being seen as a general, as one general, despite their disability, despite that they are women, despite that they are older, despite that they are toddlers. So victims or casualty are being seen as one and general. So women most of the time, and those who are being marginalized, for example, indigenous group, having difficulties in accessing the climate finance. requirements such as asset ownership, and then business skill, and then access to information, membership in cooperative favor men than women and those being marginalized. So this is one of the obstacles being faced by women and minority groups, the kind that limit access and benefit that they need most. So in my perspective, many women in forest areas and rural parts depend on forestry in Indonesia and water and climate vulnerable agriculture for their livelihood. But women, especially the poorest, lack key access such as land, credits, information, and technology to prepare for and adapt to the climate change. How we could improve decision making, I think we have to elicit input and participation from a wide range of voices, the voices of the Indigenous women, the voices of the disability groups, and the voices of other marginalized groups, because their solution, their experience are likely more to be designed and accepted, and inclusion treated equitably with respect, valued, and have a sense of belonging. So they have safe to speak up, empowered to grow, and have a better representation that bring better solution. I think that's all. Sorry if I take too much time. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Dewi. I think you did cover quite a number of the different points, and hopefully we can bring more of it up in the discussion in between. Without further ado, I'm going to hand over to you, Lily, Executive Director of the Green Agriculture Youth Organization. Some reflections from you around your experiences, the injustice and exclusion that you may have seen, and I would imagine predominantly in the youth space, and your own role and how things could work differently. 5 minutes. Over to you, Lily.
Thank you so much, moderator. So for me, on my part, I think despite evidence demonstrating how youths are change makers with the ability to transform the order of day-to-day ways of life through innovation and technology, the youths have not been given the space they need to contribute to development. And for some time now, you find that youth involvement is just a piecemeal and doesn't support grassroots consultation inputs. In some cases, a young leader who represents a certain constituency may be invited for consultations, but may not have the resources and means to get input from grassroots and marginalized groupings. So the technical language around climate change doesn't make certain policy discussions attractive to the youths. Normally, our community engagement shows that youths are feeling the effects of climate change, but sometimes considers this as normal. So without them understanding its climate change. So this calls for extensive reach out to the youths feeling the impact of climate change. And again, co-creating has been one area where most partners working in the fight against climate change have not done too well. So for example, marginalized communities in the community where I work, which include the youth, women, and children, have not been part of the solution development processes, and yet they're expected to run with what has been created for them. So this results to rural youths, women, and children that are usually attending partner meetings, not as co-creators, but as audiences for climate solutions developed in air-conned boardrooms. So I can say for me as a youth working in Green Agriculture Youth Organization, I feel like we can try to change this situation by adopting a human-centered design approach that places the affected groups at the center of solution development processes. So I can just say that for now, and as we continue, I'll keep coming in and just say more on finance for NGOs and everything. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Lily. Very powerful and much appreciated. I do like the idea of a human-centered design approach, but also you did mention the process of co-creation. It's something that you cannot be taken for granted, and bringing the youth and different marginalized groups along as working out the solution together, not simply as audiences for the solutions that have been created. Over to you, Melanie, who's the program's coordinator for Slum Dwellers International Zambia. A few words from you around your experience, with non-inclusive decision-making, the injustice and exclusion that you may have witnessed, and what in your role you are already doing differently or could do differently to address this issue. Over to you, Melanie.
Thank you, Josh. For our experience in terms of the injustices that are in our work and what we see most communities facing, is that in our country, in Zambia, we have a situation where we have very good policies that are set up. But one challenge we see is that these policies end up just being shelved. I will give a typical example of where our housing policy of 1996 even won a UN award, and it stated that 15% of our national budget would go to housing and improving the lives of communities. However, we never saw that. At most, I think we got about 3% in the national budget. And when we talk about issues of resilience and building communities that are able to withstand the shocks of climate change, and you look at housing as one of those issues, it's very clear that year after year, we have been trying to champion and make sure that housing is seen as a priority, as a means for communities to be able to withstand the shocks of climate change. Most of the homes that people live in the informal settlements are subjected to strong winds. You find their roofs being blown off, their homes collapsing, and them not being able to access finance through the conventional means, because women and poor people are expected to produce bank statements, they're expected to produce pay slips to be able to access finance. But when you're looking at an ordinary person within the community, they are unable to get this documentation. And then of course, they have to also compete with people who have the means to do that. And so they are systematically excluded from these spaces. And also in just making the policies themselves, you find that many a times we have been invited as the supporting NGO to the Zambia Homeless and Poor People's Federation. That's the grassroots movement. And it's almost like every time you have to remind the government to say, what about the grassroots? They need to be involved. They need to sit at the table as well. So we have been pushing that. And now we see them identifying the federation, the grassroots movement, as a key stakeholder. And now they've begun to recognize them and to invite them into these spaces where they can come and be part of the policy. Because if you go down to the communities and you ask a community member, what do you know about the climate policy? What do you know about the housing policy? They probably would not know anything, because these policies are not even translated into their local language or into a simple way that they're able to understand. Equally, issues of climate change, you find that they're put in such a way that it's very difficult for an ordinary member in the community to be able to understand what are these greenhouse gases and emissions. But if you ask them about what they are feeling, the impacts of climate change, they'll be able to tell you they're faced with the flooding, they're seeing the weather patterns are changing, it's becoming hotter. And me living in my house made out of inferior materials, when it gets hot, it gets really hot. And when it gets cold, I really feel the cold. So you have all those issues that come up, and we are trying to change the way people look at the community members as just mere beneficiaries, but as equal participants. And through our work and the work we do as SDI is that community members come together, they meet, they talk about their problems, and they act upon their problems and engage with the government and make sure government hears their voice and sees them as equal partners, as key stakeholders in their own development. I will end there for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Melanie, and especially, introducing the important element of local and indigenous knowledge, which is so often excluded and undervalued in the policy and decision-making space. Over to you, Brenda, who's with the Zambia Homeless and Poor People's Federation. Some thoughts from you and reflections around these three questions we are looking at. What is the level of injustice? What can be done? Yeah, over to you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Brenda Tembo. I am a member of Zambia Homeless and Poor People's Federation. We work in partnership with People's Process on Housing and Poverty in Zambia. And the Alliance is affiliated to Slum Dwellers International. As I said earlier, my name is Brenda. I live in a slum. For me, as a slum dweller, I feel we've been mostly excluded in decision-making. I think I'll put it in an example way. For example, when land is being allocated to people, and it's something that we know that government should give land to ordinary community members, but whenever there is land available, this land has never been availed to us as ordinary people. We don't even know where to start from. And from the National Housing the policy, it says that land should be allocated to women, even ordinary women like us. But when it comes to real implementation of this allocation, ordinary women like me are usually left out. So with this, I feel we are not included. Even again, in the national housing policy, there is this issue of building houses for people in different communities. But what happens here in our country is that when the government builds houses, it's only for our colleagues in uniform, like the army, the soldiers, and the police. In low-cost housing for people like me, there is nothing. That way, I feel we are not included. So for us, with what we like, okay, one of the rituals of the Federation is to save. So we save towards buying our own land to build houses. And usually we cannot afford that beautiful land that is being available. So wherever we found land, we buy that. And it's something that we have done. We bought land, but this land is in a flood-prone area. So after we saw that there's nothing much for the ordinary people, we did organize a march to the Ministry of Housing and Infrastructure so that we could hear what they have offered for ordinary women and other vulnerable people in communities. So when we marched to the Ministry of Housing, the Ministry of Infrastructure and Housing, we presented our petition to the minister. And through that, recently we saw the permanent secretary coming to see what we are doing at our housing site. And he promised that they will help with the putting up a drainage there. So slowly, we feel we'll be included in decision making. I think I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brenda, and especially for raising, the element of the levels of action that local communities and local groups are able to undertake, and what is needed in terms of support for these groups, rather than, as a previous speaker mentioned, treating different groups and communities as audiences. They're completely capable of deciding what course of action they need to take. What is needed is support and a space at the decision-making tables where policies are being formulated in order for this support to be meaningful. Thank you very much for that. And I am going to then switch over to our last speaker for short reflections. Welcome to you, Samela, Sateré, Mawé, who's with the National Articulation of Indigenous Women Warriors of Ancestrality from Brazil. A warm welcome to you. And for those of you who are using English, you could switch over to the Brazilian Portuguese channel. Welcome, Samela. Welcome, Samela.
Bom dia, gente. Eu me chamo Samela, Sateré Mawé. Eu sou indígena do povo Sateré Mawé, daqui da Amazônia, do norte do Brasil. Eu sou ativista ambiental e faço parte da Articulação Nacional das Mulheres Indígenas Guerreiras da Ancestralidade. Também sou estudante de biologia. Aqui no Brasil, nós viemos sofrendo várias ameaças do governo federal, principalmente no que tange à defesa do nosso território. Existem vários projetos de lei em tramitação que ameaçam as terras indígenas. E aqui no Brasil há um grande interesse em utilizar os territórios indígenas para fins como garimpo, como mineração, como desmatamento, como queimadas, arrendamentos e grilagem. Então, a gente está sofrendo um período muito crítico na vida dos povos indígenas do Brasil. Então, a gente está nos mobilizando desde o ano passado contra esses projetos de lei. Um desses projetos de lei é o marco temporal, que leva em consideração que os povos indígenas são donos do seu território apenas durante a data da Constituição do Brasil, que foi em 1988. Só que antes da Constituição do Brasil, os povos indígenas eram tutelados, então não tinham como estar no seu território na data de 88. Então, se eles não tivessem agora, eles não são donos. Então, isso a gente luta diariamente para que isso não seja levado em consideração, porque nós somos povos originários. E está em tramitação também no Congresso o PL 191, que é o PL da mineração, que regulamenta as questões da mineração em territórios indígenas. Há especificamente 2 ou 3 povos indígenas que são diretamente afetados pela mineração, porque quando há mineração nos territórios, há despejo de mercúrio nos rios. Então, o mercúrio é um agente tóxico que age diretamente no sistema nervoso central, e que houve uma pesquisa em que os povos Munduruku, que ficam no rio Tapajós, também na Amazônia, e o povo Yanomami, estão completamente contaminados por mercúrio. Então, as mães elas já têm medo de ter seus filhos, porque têm medo de eles nascerem doentes. E o povo Yanomami sofre também diariamente conflitos entre garimpeiros. E já muitos parentes foram assassinados, porque há uma política de exploração dos territórios indígenas e não há interesse do governo em demarcar os territórios indígenas. Então, nós fomos para a COP26 com uma delegação de cerca de 40 indígenas do Brasil, inclusive da Amazônia, denunciar todas essas atrocidades que acontecem no nosso território, porque nós acreditamos que nós, povos indígenas, somos os principais defensores do meio ambiente, porque desde a invasão do Brasil, nós estamos na luta pela demarcação do território, porque nós sabemos que os territórios demarcados são as terras que mais se tem biodiversidade, que mais se tem preservação. Então, a gente está vivendo um retrocesso no Brasil, mas também estamos lutando para que os nossos direitos eles sejam garantidos, direitos constitucionais, porque na Constituição diz que nós somos povos originários e temos direito originário à terra onde nós habitamos. Então, nós sofremos vários impactos ambientais e socioambientais. Enquanto indígenas, nós somos os principais afetados também pelas mudanças climáticas, pela mudança do tempo, porque nós não estamos nos espaços de tomada de decisão, nós estamos no espaço de construção, mas isso precisa ser construído com a gente. Nada é feito por nós sem nós. Nós queremos estar dentro dos espaços, queremos estar com os grandes líderes de tomada de decisão para que as nossas questões elas sejam ouvidas enquanto pessoas que sofrem diariamente os impactos das mudanças climáticas. Se a gente sofre os efeitos das consequências das decisões das pessoas, Por que a gente não pode também participar das decisões, se nós somos os principais afetados? Isso é justiça climática. Então, a gente precisa também estar. Então, o recado que eu queria deixar para as mulheres, para os jovens, para a juventude, para os povos indígenas, é que nós lutamos pelos nossos direitos e que nós não deixamos essas políticas, essas atrocidades e essas irreverências nos abalarem, porque nós somos fortes, nós somos resistentes, nós precisamos estar nesses espaços. Obrigada.
Thank you very, very much. And it is indeed a privilege to have you join the meeting, Samela, and thank you for your strong words, an exhortation to stand up and speak out against injustice, which is very, very clearly evident against the indigenous peoples and First Nations of Brazil, facing mining laws that are looking at taking away ancestral lands, and how the inclusion in the decision-making processes is the first step in order to seek redress for some of these issues. We are now going to go to our first Mentimeter question. I'm going to ask the team to share that on the stage, but on the screen. But while we're doing that, so what we would like you as the audience members to help us think through via this Mentimeter link is the notion that climate change decision-making takes place at local, national, and obviously regional at global levels. And we often say that locally led adaptation, like we started to say, requires us to have voices from the local level amplified and heard all the way till the global level. And we are obviously wondering whether this is the way to go. So the statement that will be appearing on your screen that we would like you to vote on whether you agree or disagree is the following. We should focus our energy on influencing only local and national decision-making. We have greater chance of impact there, and attempts to influence decision-making at global level will fail because local stories and experiences will always be diluted by more influential and international non-governmental organizations or other actors at that stage. So that is the statement that, that we are going to be voting on. You're going to be asked to vote whether you agree or disagree with this statement. So please go ahead. I hope everybody has no problems accessing the link, and we shall start seeing the results come through. Please, if you do have any issues accessing the link, pop it in the chat and we'll see if we can assist you. All right. Oh, so right now we are, well, a sum total of 2 people. So yeah, so I'm watching the numbers and seeing quite a lot of people disagreeing with this statement. And my understanding of disagreement with this statement would be that we cannot only focus energy on influencing local and national decision-making frameworks, and that the global level, and obviously, you know, if you think about it, in a globalized world in which we live, where the global affects the local in a very cyclical way, it is equally important to focus on the global level, and in some ways probably provide spaces to put that international pressure at the local level in order for the policies to change. Of course, bearing in mind the multilateral frameworks that our countries are members to and party to, and how those decisions affect local level decisions. Clearly there is a greater level of disagreement with this statement than there is agreement. So why is anybody willing to talk to us? And I'm going to speak, look to you, our original speakers. Why is it so important that the international and the global level be focused on, in as much, if not more than the local level decision-making structures? And how can we ensure the correct impact of the voices at this level? Going to look to you, any of our speakers. Dewi, do you maybe want to reflect a little bit on this?
Thank you. I think inclusive decision making have to consider several things. The first one is to ensure full participation of all parties. I think it is not only about voicing, but also in terms of documenting, their experience dealing with the climate change. So in the past 10 years, we worked together like a female researcher in Indonesia to link between the climate change, the ecology, and women and feminism. So we make, as you see in the my screen, we initiate a series of ecofeminism in the last 10 years to mainstream climate change as in the university as well as gender. So by ensuring full participation of all the researchers in documenting many experiences, this book could provide like inclusive decision-making principle at the first hand. And then the second is creating mutual understanding by networking and interconnecting all the researcher and all the publication. So they can now and informing each other between different and diverse and intersectional discipline. Because in Indonesia, most of the time, the license to destruct the forest is coming from the university. So by sounding on these matters, on the climate change and how it impacted women as well as the marginalized group, the university will no longer in the future becoming the permit license to destroy the forest. And then the third is that we have to develop inclusive solution which generated from shared responsibility. For example, in the last 6 years, we've been working together with the Ibu-Ibu Kendeng. It is the mothers of the Kendeng mountain range, because most of the salmon corporation globally has been shut down in the Eastern Europe and in China. So they look for the raw material in Indonesia because it is much easier to work with the quote-unquote corrupt government or government transitional. Many forests in Indonesia is being exploited to give the supply of the salmon corporation. And it is becoming the only ways for the women who are living across the mountain range to speak against, to fight against the corporation. So for us, as a modern people, like having ecological protest is just quote unquote a social protest, but for these women, this is like a spiritual path for them, these indigenous women. So I within our research, we documented that defending the nature against the destruction, defending the forest against exploitation is becoming the new spiritual path that they are now fight for. I think that's the experience that we have in Indonesia. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Samara, I will come to you with this question. Looking at the situation that the indigenous populations are facing in Brazil, with the threat that is faced, that the ancestral lands are facing against the mining companies, especially even at the legal level, you know, the laws, there's a threat from the law, from a law perspective. If this fight was taken to a global level, what level of influence do you feel would come from the global level to impact local level? And do you think it would help? Do you think it would add solidarity? Do you think it would add support to local indigenous groups if the international community was in solidarity with you?
Eu acredito que sim, pois a gente viu um retrato disso na COP26 e a ajuda que a gente recebe, nós povos indígenas do Brasil, e o apoio que nós recebemos de outros países. Eles estão mais solidarizados com a questão do nosso ambiente, da nossa floresta, da Amazônia, dos nossos rios, do que os próprios brasileiros. Então, eles entendem a importância de preservar, porque no país deles, acho que isso ainda é escasso, né? Está acabando. Aqui a gente ainda tem uma biodiversidade bem grande, então as pessoas aqui não pensam em manter, pensam em destruir também. Então, a gente acha que com a ajuda de outras pessoas, de outros países que também pensam em preservar, a gente consiga manter nosso bioma, nossa biodiversidade e, consequentemente, a nossa vida. Porque muitas das vezes a gente paga a defesa do nosso território com a vida mesmo.
Thank you very much for those reflections. Lily, I'm going to come to you, especially around issues of youth. What is the value of building solidarity at a global level with other global youth movements, and how does that support or enhance the ability to push for greater inclusion in decision making at a local level? Are there, for example, successes at the global level or in different countries in different spaces that are evident enough to put pressure to create some kind of change at a local level, in terms of focusing on elevating these voices to a global level? How important has that been in the youth space, for example?
Thank you, moderator. So I think the space for climate change and climate action has really been taken over by gatekeepers. So I feel like this space does not really include youths, women, and the marginalized communities to take it over, because they are the ones that are facing these challenges every day. So for example, I can give you what happens in my area in Zambia, in Chongwe. We have young people's organizations that have come up with interventions to save trees and cut on deforestation and begin to have new ways of cooking for clean energy. So what happens is that these young people have these interventions and innovations, but then they don't have the support at a local level to elevate them to the national or rather global level. So they should be heard through these same interventions. For example, I can tell you that for us as youths in Green Agriculture Youth Organization, we are able to be on this platform today because of HIVO Zambia, for they allowed us to at least access some funding through a consortium that we partnered with, which is called Civil Society Scaling Up Nutrition. And, we were considered to be given some sort of funding, which is helping us support these local interventions. For example, the rocket stoves and the organic chemical use from cassava leaves, all these interventions that these young people are coming up with, they can only be heard if they are included right at the space where they are in their communities. So I would advise that it would be best that when we are beginning all these processes, we pick them from a grassroots level where they are, as we move in stages to the national, and then we go to a global level. So let's hear them from a stage where they are as at now. I think that's what I can say. Thanks. Over to you.
No, thank you for those reflections, Lily. So, I mean, basically you're saying we cannot look at this as a zero-sum game where focus at local level means exclusion of the global level, but exploring ways in which the global, the national, and the local are all linked and how there can be synergies drawn from those. And I think it's probably the right moment to come to you, Melanie, given that Slum Dwellers International is one of those that, as well as having strong local presence presence in different countries has also got a very strong global presence. So how do you, as Slum Dwellers International, not just as Zambia, but as the global entity that is Slum Dwellers International, how do you negotiate the local versus the national and the global space? How does that coordination happen? And what are the results that you see coming out of that?
Thank you, Josh. For Slum Dwellers International, we are a global network, and we have federations, that's grassroots communities, and our support NGOs across Africa, Asia, and South America. And so through our network, we are able to have a critical mass and have one voice. And we often participate in global events such as the World Urban Forum, and other events have been like COP26, where some of our members have participated, and in different global events. And we also seek to have a table at the big meetings and make an impact by speaking in those events, and also having a space at the table, like being given leadership positions so that we can influence at a higher level. Our research work also helps, because in all our various countries, we collect data about our communities, and the communities themselves collect the data. And for a long time, people have thought about communities collecting data, and they start to think, is it valid data? And it has proved that the information that federations collect has a lot of richness in it, and a lot of learning can be taken out of that. Our exchange visits also bring about a lot of learning and sharing between the countries and within, if we look at it from a local perspective, where we've been able to influence governments from one country to another. Some governments have not been able to understand that poor people can actually make a plan and come up with a GIS map. And yet within the federations, they have been able to do that and form partnerships with local authorities where they can plan for a settlement, plan for the city, and influence at that level. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And then I'm going to lastly come to you very quickly, Brenda, just to reflect a little bit on what your experience has been as a very, very locally focused organization, dealing with grassroots, working with grassroots populations. Has there been in your work any influence that you have seen of global level intervention or global level solidarity having a positive impact, if any, on the work that you do at the local level? Brenda, are you there?
Yes, thank you. I think for us, yes, my experience is that whatever we share at global platforms or at a global level has had a lot of influence in our communities or in our country. Because when we go at these global platforms, we share experiences and also learn from each other. And whatever we learn, we come and replicate that in our own country, in our own, and in our own communities.
Thank you very much for that, Brenda. I think I'm also keeping an eye on the chat and the Q&A, and just to remind you, if you have any questions or interventions, please make use of that space. But also just looking at time, I would like us to maybe take some time and move to the second statement that we want to look up. I'm going to ask for that to be put up. So we often see events and public participation processes, whether at a global, regional, national, or local level, that allow for the participation of local actors. Now, participation of local actors is only a tick box exercise, and even if local voices are heard, they are not listened to because of structural inequalities that continue to exist. Again, we are going to ask you to answer yes, that you agree or that you disagree with the statement that participation of local actors is only a tick box exercise. And even when local voices are heard, they are not listened to because there are still persisting structural inequalities. And we will let you vote. I hope everybody has access to, yes, I can see lots of votes coming in. So far, there's overwhelming agreement with the statement that it is a tick box exercise. One disagreement, 8 agreements so far. But while this is coming in, I think at this stage, we can quite safely say that most people agree with this statement. So a couple of follow-up questions to this for our panelists, and I will come to you individually, but also just give you the floor to speak. Why do you think, why in your view are the local voices not really being listened to? And what is the cause of this structural inequality that means that even when they're listened to, they're not heard? And what, in your view, in cases where you may have experienced it, has real meaningful participation looked like? What has been the difference in those instances where you may have seen real participation and the general sense where in most cases local participation is merely a tick box exercise? And how do we, in our work in our different stations, start to create spaces that allow for this meaningful participation? We noted that it's a structural issue. What needs to be done to restructure spaces in order for meaningful participation to take place? And what can you do differently in your particular space to ensure that when local voices are invited to participate in decision-making, that they are not just there to tick a box, so that somebody can write a report and say that local voices were heard, local voices were consulted. I'll start with you again, Dewi. Any thoughts on this from your particular space?
Thank you. My apology. I'm sorry that I'm having a heavy rain here, so I got difficulty listening to you, but I can catch your point. I'm sorry if the voice of the heavy rain is also involving in my opinion. Yeah. Okay. I think the origin of the exploitation of the nature is in parallel to the exploitation of the minorities group and those being marginalized. And this exploitation is still there, yeah, and including women. I think the phenomenon are the result of the belief that the dominance of humanity over nature is being justified, and caring for the environment comes from caring for human society, and this must go hand in hand. Respect for other people is associated with respect for living entities that we do not recognize as human beings. So we combine the ignoring of the minority group, ignoring women voices, ignoring the sexual minorities voices related with the climate, and they are being exploited. Animals and raw materials, especially from forests in Indonesia, are being treated as if they had simply been seen provided for all the time, and humanity could dispose of them at its leisure. But they are deeply connected to us, and their exploitation is resulting in the approaching of the ecosystem collapse. And how we could deal with it, I think we have to seek out marginalized voices and perspective, and taking seriously their personal stories and experiences, because their story, their experiences will greatly inform our point of view, especially in the adaptation and mitigation to the climate change. We have to bring them to the decision table, and we have to share roles as well, so that a sense of belonging to this could be enhanced. I think that's all. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Dewi. And just to pause there on a technical note, we understand that sometimes with Zoom we have gremlins. Just to let everybody know that sometimes if you find that your translation is not running in the correct channel, if you're looking for Portuguese and you cannot hear it on the Portuguese channel, please try the English channel as well, and vice versa, because the translation is running. Sometimes the channels do switch. We apologize, but we're going to make sure that at any given point you can hear the language that you need to be listening to. I'm going to come to you, Lily, on this, because I know you've got quite strong views around the participation of youth through your organization and from your experience. What needs to happen so that we do not have tick box exercises, so we do not have cosmetic inclusion and participation of youth and other groups?
Thank you, moderator. So for me, I still feel that we youths, women, and marginalized communities are just called to the table to be used and actually to tick a box. For example, if you are called to be consulted on climate finance and you tell them that this is a problem that we are facing and this is a solution that we need from you people as decision makers, you know, they will tell you, yes, we've listened to your views, please go back and we'll get back to you. And what happens next? You never get a call from them. And as a result of this, I've seen many young people's organizations collapse because they are not heard, they are just being listened. There's no action taken upon. For example, when they hear that you need small money to just, you know, elevate an innovation, they'll not give you money. But they heard you, they listen to you when you sat on that table, but they'll not give you the money, they'll not support you so that you have these interventions be settled. So what I'm trying to say is that I feel like we should have a strong building on the capacity of youths as today, because they are the future leaders and they would be a key to driving climate action. So let's allow youth participation in climate action so that we can improve and give them initiatives that they can grow up with, as well as structured education, financial, as well as monitoring and evaluation aid. So that at least, you know, as we are coming to the table, we are airing our views. When we go back, we should go to sleep and know that tomorrow a decision maker that we dialogue with has listened to us and has come back to us and they have given us this solution. You know, that's the only way we're going to grow and we're going to fight this climate change issue. And this is the only way that solutions are going to continue to be built in communities. Because if we're talking about local-led solutions, it means we're including all youths, women, and marginalized communities on the table for them to decide what they want. So I feel like there's nothing that should be made for me without me being there at the table. Over to you, Chair. Thanks.
Thank you very much for those reflections, Lily. Melanie, I'm going to come to you again because I think SDI, Slum Dwellers International, given the work that you have done and what you've been able to achieve, you indeed are probably sitting with a lot of best practices at this regard, you know, in this regard, you know, your ability to take local level voices and elevate those into meaningful participation at the global level. What needs to happen? What needs to happen for these spaces to be created? How do we create these spaces that allow for meaningful participation from your experience? How do we get local leadership and knowledge to be elevated and to flourish?
Sorry, Josh, could you
yes.
repeat the question? You are breaking at the moment.
Okay, apologies for that. Can you hear me better now? Are you able to hear me? Am I clear for everybody else?
Yes, I think Melanie is having a problem.
Okay, good. All right. Melanie, we will come back to you. In the meantime, let me go over to you, Samela. Samela, in your...
No, I can't hear you. You were breaking.
Am I breaking up for everybody?
No, Melanie, I think your line has a problem.
Okay. Melanie, I will come back to you. Let me first go over to Samela and ask you, Samela, what needs to happen for meaningful participation for all groups to actually be a reality? How do we move beyond the tick boxing? How do you end up in a situation where when Indigenous groups have a presence at the global stage, whether it is being invited to multilateral spaces like COP, how does that have real impact beyond just showcasing and listening, but no action being taken?
Resultado dessa questão foi na COP26, onde nós tivemos a delegação oficial do Brasil, que eram os governantes, ministros, o ministro do Meio Ambiente, o ministro de Minas e Energia, todos os ministros estavam na COP26 para tomar as decisões por todos os brasileiros, inclusive os povos indígenas. Só que eles estavam falando grandes mentiras, falando que se comprometiam com a preservação, se comprometiam com o Brasil, mas quando os verdadeiros originários do Brasil estavam lá, que eram os indígenas, eles viraram as costas para a gente. Então, a gente estava lá tentando construir, tentando ser ouvidos enquanto povos originários, mas eles não estavam ligando para o que a gente tinha para falar. E fecharam acordos muito milionários, com muito dinheiro, em cima dos povos indígenas, usando o nome dos povos indígenas, mas nada é construído com os povos indígenas. Então, eles querem trabalhar com povos indígenas, mas não querem trabalhar com a gente, com os povos indígenas. A gente também consegue, tem um modelo de organização muito bom. Um exemplo disso é a articulação dos povos indígenas do Brasil, onde nós conseguimos gerir os nossos territórios, e especificamente contra o governo mesmo, e com essa criminalização de lideranças e tudo mais. Então, uma base muito importante é o investimento na juventude. A gente viu o protagonismo da juventude brasileira e a juventude indígena nesses espaços. A gente tem uma ferramenta muito boa hoje em dia, que é a internet, que possibilita a gente conversar agora nessa reunião. Eu estou aqui em Manaus, no Amazonas, na Amazônia, no Brasil. Aqui são 8 horas da manhã. E vocês estão em outros cantos do mundo, e eu não sei que horas é aí, mas a gente consegue conversar. E isso é muito bom. Então, é a internet que possibilita isso. Então, nós, jovens, utilizamos a internet como uma ferramenta de luta e resistência. A gente pode falar para as pessoas, independente das grandes mídias de comunicação que vetam a nossa palavra, a gente fala para as outras pessoas o que realmente está acontecendo. A gente denuncia o que está acontecendo. Porque se a gente for defender dos governantes, que são os donos que compram as grandes mídias, nós nunca vamos aparecer. Nós nunca vamos ter a possibilidade de falar para as pessoas o que nós vivemos no nosso dia a dia. Então, é preciso, sim, que nós estejamos nos espaços de tomada de decisão, mas também nós precisamos de possibilidades de formação, de educação, para que a nossa juventude indígena e os próprios indígenas que também já estão inseridos na questão da internet consigam estar nesses espaços. Esse espaço aqui que eu estou é um espaço que poucos conseguem ter. É um espaço que poucos conseguem ter um espaço de fala, assim. Eu estou falando aqui com vocês da Amazônia. Eu tenho uma internet, tenho um computador e tudo mais, mas vários outros parentes não têm isso. Então, isso possibilita que a gente alcance mais espaços. Então, acho muito importante que a juventude esteja cada dia mais inserida, os povos indígenas cada dia mais inseridos, e que nossas vozes sejam ouvidas quando as pessoas forem tomar de decisão. que a gente não seja só moeda de troca para grandes acordos financeiros com outros países e falando que vão trabalhar com povos indígenas. Nós não queremos isso, nós queremos ser protagonistas, estar nesses espaços e nós gerir os nossos recursos. Obrigada.
Thank you very much, Samela. And you actually raise a really good point that I'd like probably to give the chance to the other panelists to talk a little bit about, because there actually, it's two related elements here. One being the voices that are missing. The second being the influence that those voices can have on policies and decision-making and being part of the decision-making process. When it comes to the voices and those voices being heard, because a lot of times the sheer volume of, if you allow the voices to be heard, the sheer volume of the voices forces the hand of those who maintain the structures as they are to open the doors so that those voices become participants. What has the new modes of communication, what has that brought us? What has the internet, what has, I mean, Samela clearly tells us that, for them, being far away and being as rural as possible does not make a difference, because their voices can still be heard in that space, regardless of what other obstacles are placed in terms of access in the more traditional ways. What has your experience been as organizations in your ability to find alternative spaces, use the internet to increase the volume of those voices and access those spaces where traditionally the voices would not be heard? Maybe come to you, Melanie. Melanie, are you able to hear and respond? If not, then I can go to Lily and then come back to you.
Okay, yes, I can hear you now. In terms of our work and SDI, we have a platform that we call the Know Your City TV. And this is driven by the young people, the youths. And they have been able to put out the stories about what is going on in the informal settlements, share their stories about challenges they're facing with flooding, challenges they're facing with houses collapsing, and different things that are affecting communities in terms of the garbage that is piling up and not being collected. And even though we have all these platforms where communities are invited to go and speak and share their challenges, and they're not being heard, and this is not being addressed. And this platform has been able to share the stories and tell the leaders, the office bearers, the powers that be of the stories. And this is from around the world. So different countries are sharing on the Know Your City TV platform, and they're able to share our stories. So we have to create our own spaces where we are able to put out what we are fighting and to tell them this is the kind of support we need and this is the kind of partnership we'd like to build. We're also able to share the different type of work that we're doing, the precedents that we are setting, and where we have managed to partner with local authorities, with government, that those platforms tell our stories and others are able to hear and say, okay, we want to participate and be a part of this network, and the federation is then seen and the community is seen as a key stakeholder in the decision-making process and in influencing change in the way things are done. We also use academia and changing the way the academics work and influencing from that level, where now they're able to understand that even community data, community information, community stories matter, and push that agenda and change the narrative of communities should be just seen as beneficiaries and not heard. And they just need to be consulted. 1 or 2 meetings and they say, oh, the community was consulted. The communities don't want to be consulted. They want to be involved and they want to participate at every level. Yeah, thank you.
Sorry about that. Thank you so much. And while your internet and your line is nice and clear, maybe a word from you, Brenda, as well.
I think for us to be heard, we need to come up with a stronger voice. And this can only be done by building a bigger movement, a strong movement. Because if I am alone, I believe I cannot be heard. But if we are many, therefore it will be easier for governments to hear us. And like what I shared in the first place, that we organized a big march to the Ministry of Housing and Infrastructure. I think that's what we need to do. We need to be organized, build movements that can be heard by governments the world over. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you very much for raising a very important point. I mean, for us, the Voice for Just Climate Action, movement building is one of those key pillars that we are working on. And the importance of building global solidarity or regional solidarity around an issue, and the impact that that has on amplifying those voices, and in a lot of ways, arm twisting policy frameworks to change and to listen to these voices which were otherwise excluded, becomes very, very important. I'm looking at our time, but also keeping an eye on the chat box for any questions, any comments in the comment section, and it is quiet so far. I would like to come to, I might have seen a hand go up briefly, but if it does come up, I'll point it out again. Dewi, can I come to you for some reflections on this?
Thank you. I think we have to think again and reflect how we could enhance diverse as well as intersectional voices could be included in the table. And I think we have also to reflect again the type of the voices. So it is not only just a narrative and verbal voices, because voices are diverse as well. It could be a visual voices. It could be voices coming from the experiences, voices from the spiritual call. So diverse and intersectional voices should be taken into account as part of important, vital, and serious experience that could be playing a significant part in the adaptation and mitigation of the climate change. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dewi. And again, I'm going to invite any of the participants, any of the organizations that have been part of this. Yes, Celine, your hand is up. Please go ahead.
Josh, first of all, you have been a fantastic moderator. And with the questions you're asking, I know you have experienced inequity and you know what it means. And having worked in the front line for many years, this is exactly what has been my preoccupation. And I really think that, like you started off the session saying, that we first need to have the reflection. What do we do in our organizations? Or what do we individuals that come in the way of, not allowing community leaders to grow or coming in the way of participation? And I think for me, that's $1 million question, because it's easy to point fingers at, the funders or the government or, it's more difficult to actually catch what's happening very close to you at home. And it's people like you and me and, the people who interfere in the lives of poor people, sometimes who are the biggest culprit and who are actually suffocating poor people, if I can use that word, and don't allow them to grow, because we are so busy trying to make ourselves grow and shine that we forget that the actual role of the change agent, or the actual role of people who intervene in the lives of poor communities. And I have seen the global advocacy thing actually work to the detriment of poor communities. I've been part of a large organization and a founder member of Slum Dwellers International. And one sees that the line is very thin between global advocacy and local accountability. And you actually create monsters out of local leaders who are become so good at talking globally and without any accountability locally. And it's not their fault. It's how we It's how we design and how we open up the space for this kind of participation to happen. And so I think this being cognizant of these kind of delicate issues is something we need to have the courage to talk about.
Thank you very much for very, very useful reflection, Celine. In fact, and I see your hand, Lily, I'll come to you in just a moment. This is one of the things that for us at Voices for Just Climate Action, we, right from the inception phase, was one of the things that we were very, very careful around what you, Celine, call that delicate balance. You know, there is the global side of advocacy, and there is the on-the-ground action within the regions and the different countries. How do you balance that, and how do you make sure that you are not doing injustice to local level concerns? How do you keep the door open for meaningful participation and consultation, and not just basically creating pipelines that allow you to take local issues to the global stage? Sometimes there will be moments where local action is what is required. There are moments where that local action depends on global action, but knowing the difference between the two and knowing how to act appropriately in different spaces in order not to end up stifling voices that you should actually be amplifying becomes very, very important. Lily, your hand was up. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Josh. So for us, what we are doing in Chongwe, through the support from HIVOS, we're given a media platform that we use to air out our voices. It's called Kalemba. So what we came up with was youth platforms and children's parliament, as well as the youth parliament. And this one is held twice a year. So what happens is the children and youths, we pick 10 champions that go back in their communities and pick all these effects of climate change that they are facing. And then when we have that youth parliament day, where the minister of that green economy, as well as the member of parliament of Chongwe area, comes to meet them in that day, they come to dialogue and they air out what they are facing. And then she tells them what the government is planning to do. And then they follow up on the next meeting that happens at the end of the year. So it happens with the same with the youth platform that we have. They also do the same. They go back, collect the data on what effects of climate change they are facing, and come back and report back to their member of parliament on that youth parliament day. So we have a number of platforms that we've formed so that we can have women, youth, and children to come together and discuss these issues and take them to the decision makers of their area. And then from then, the leaders of the areas, they'll go to government when they have their parliament days, when they meet, they'll be able to air those views. And then they come back on the next meeting and they give us the answers. So I think social media is a great platform for us to continue using. And while we're having these meetings, Kalemba is always covering us live on Facebook. And, you know, we have this media engagement from a lot of people. And, you know, people are beginning to hear and are planning to jump on this program. Thank you. Over to you.
Lily, before you hand over, I'm actually going to start a round of final reflections from all of your speakers. So I'm just going to ask you to take a minute to give an exhortation. I know we have talked about the structural issues and problems, but most importantly, one of the things we mentioned was what we as organizations can do. So what I'd like you to take maybe just a minute is to speak to the organizations and institutions that are represented by the people on this call. What do we need to do to turn this around?
Thank you, Josh. So in my conclusion, I can say that to the organizations listening today, please don't just listen and go and forget about us. Please come back to us. So I'd like us to be strong a little bit more on building the capacity of youth, as well as allowing them to participate where climate change is involved. And then please support their initiatives, give them education, give them financial support, as well as an M&E tool that they can be using to track their information and everything. So I just want to ask everybody listening today, please let's support the youths and the marginalized communities with finances, such in case they're supposed to travel to Uganda where there is no Facebook, they should be able to just access resources and travel and sit on the table and discuss and air out these views. So I think, yeah, this is where I end. Thank you, Josh.
Thank you very much. I was going to come to Samela, but for some reason I don't see her. Is she still on the call? I think she has dropped off, which is unfortunate. I was going to, but we are very grateful for having had her so far. Dewi, over to you. What is your message to organizations? What do we need to do? What do we need to do better now?
I think we have to focus on the marginalized group, because most of the time international donors and the national organization ask for a legal document as well as a period of experience. But in terms of the indigenous community who organize themselves, who has no legal whatsoever paper, then it is difficult for them to access your program, to access the project, to access even the information. So I do hope that in the future or even now, there is like a reformation of the bureaucracy from the international donor as well as its consortium at the national level to take into account the indigenous community, especially women and the youth, so that their voices could have a space within this very important project. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Dewi. And I was panicking that my Q&A box was going to remain completely empty for the entirety of the 90 minutes, but thankfully, Anna has saved us from that. So Anna's question is, what role can the international community play to support bringing marginalized voices to the fore in the national and international spaces? Tandy, I'm going to hand over to you to answer this. Tandy, where are you there? I think if you're speaking, Tandiwe, you're still muted.
Sorry,
there
Josh,
we go.
repeat the question, please.
Yeah, so the question that Anna Carthy has asked is, what role can international institutions play to support bringing marginalized voices to the fore in national and international fora? So any reflections from you from the VCA perspective?
Yeah, thank you very much, Josh, for that question. In actual fact, I think our panelists have actually even responded to that question in terms of the demands that they have already put across to the global community. Because for us as a body or an alliance that is comprised of all these international organizations, our first and foremost priority is to make sure that we answer the call of the needs of these local communities. It should not just be about, physical participation. It should also be about the actions on the ground, because I think the actions that speak to addressing the much needed challenges that are on the ground in as far as climate change are concerned are what is really, really important. I really like what Lily also said with regards to making sure that at least we match what we commit in terms of statements with the resources that can go along with ensuring that all these disadvantaged communities are not just given a platform to go and speak, but are also able to act on the ground to be responsive in terms of the challenges that they face on a day-to-day basis. Of course, as international community, international organizations, our role is actually questioned in terms of, do we have the legitimacy to be actually representing local communities? This is why we really want to make sure that the people that are actually experiencing the effects of the climate change, we do everything possible to make sure that we facilitate their engagement. Thanks a lot, Josh. Over to you.
Thank you very much for that, Tandy. And I'm just noting that our time is almost up. And I see you asked a follow-up question to that, focusing specifically on international research organizations and international intermediaries. And I cannot give a full answer to that, but I can just tell you a little bit in terms of our reflections within the Voices for Just Climate Action, especially when discussing indigenous and local knowledge, and understanding that what exists as a framework around international research is founded on certain key values that sometimes has been responsible in keeping out local and indigenous knowledge in the first place. So what we need to do is relook at the lenses that we use to understand local voice, to hear local voices, to see local people, and understand if those are the same lenses with which they see themselves. So how accepting are we of indigenous and local knowledge within the traditional frameworks that we have under what we call traditional research methodologies and the rest? So maybe just something to reflect about, but keeping an eye on time. I'm hoping that maybe these conversations can carry on beyond this particular forum, but to give a very final last word to Melanie from your side in terms of a quick exhortation to the institutions represented here before we close. Literally 30 seconds, sorry about that.
Okay, thank you. In terms of action, I think, and giving space to communities and hearing them out, I think it's about understanding what communities need and the diversity of their needs, and being able to also listen to what they know, their knowledge. The local knowledge is very important, and bringing the science of climate change to a point where they can harmonize those two together. And we always talk about alternatives. I think it's important to provide affordable alternatives. So if there are organizations out there, we're talking about clean energy, I hope that we can find ways of bringing affordable alternatives. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. I think at this point, seeing as we've already run out of time, and knowing that this session is a part of a broader list of sessions that will be taking place down the line, I just like to take this opportunity to extend a really, really big expression of gratitude to you, Dewi, to Lily, to Brenda, to Melanie, and to Samela, who's not with us anymore. Thank you so much for sharing this time and for sharing your views with us. Thank you to you as the audience for participating in our polls and being part of this discussion. Thank you to everybody who was part of the organizing group in the background, Merit, Tandy, Charlotte, Karen, and the rest of the team. And we look forward to having future engagements like this. And obviously, after this meeting, there will be post communication around this. So hopefully we'll be able to further those conversations there. With that, I would like to say thank you very much for taking the time, and wishing you all a good day, good afternoon, good evening where you are. Goodbye.